This research paper is attempting to understand what differed between how the Native Americans in New Netherland treated and used animals and how the Dutch in the area treated and used animals. In other words, what were the differences between these two groups of people in regards to how they viewed animals, and why might they look at them differently? I want to prove, by comparing and contrasting the Dutch and the Native Americans and their uses of the animals, to prove that the Native Americans were far better stewards of what they had been given, even though they were labeled savages by the Dutch traders who settled near them. The historians so far have represented what has been written about the animals, and they have given examples from the Atlantic world and the New World that focus more particularly on certain animals and why they were important to the settlement. Historians over the years have written and studied about the animals, but not specifically about how they were treated and used in the area. The Columbian Exchange, a term coined by Alfred Crosby in his book, The Columbian Exchange, he defined as the migration of pathogens, flora, fauna, and people to the Atlantic world. The Atlantic world being everything that touched the Atlantic. What he's specifically going over right here is South America and the Caribbean, and how the old world ended up in the new world. Crosby indicates that a lot of animals were brought to the Caribbean, such as the pig, and was the most successful animal to be raised in this new environment. In 1514, one of the colonists actually wrote the Spanish king telling him that the number of swine that existed on the island of Cuba now was more than 30,000, which according to him was more pigs than he ever saw in his life. Crosby also indicates that cattle were also thriving in the New World. He mentions the climate had something to do with the better reproduction of both the cattle and the pigs. Instead of reproducing once a year, the cattle reproduced 2 or 3 times a year. And since the cattle and the pigs roamed and grazed freely, they were stronger than their counterparts back in Europe. The location where this began was the Caribbean, according to Crosby, on the coastal islands. He also says that by the time Cortez arrived, the Caribbean was the perfect base camp for the assault. Fortunately, the Spanish did not complain very much about the reproduction rate of the pigs like the North Americans would later in North America, because they loved to eat pork. They were very pleased that the pig flesh was in large supply. Explorers passing through the different islands were even encouraged to take a male and female pig to the neighboring islands and leave it there so they could breed, so that the next people who stopped at the island would have a food source in the future. Juliet Clutton Brock writes about the animals in America that were domesticated. She looks at the dog, and she even hints that maybe the Native Americans may have had domesticated hunting dogs that they used. When I say domesticated, it's not the same domesticated that we would think of now. It was closer to a wild animal, but they just were able to control it a little bit. She doesn't give enough evidence here, though, to come to a final conclusion that they did have domesticated dogs. She just hints at it. She also talks about the turkey. Turkey, which was originally wild, of course, only occurs in North America. Since they are native to North America, it is safe to say that the turkeys were probably hunted by the Native Americans, according to Clutton Brock. It's possible that they used their feathers and bones as tools and ornaments. Brett Mizell goes a little further in detail to discuss only the pig. He picks up into what Crosby was talking about, saying that the pig was originally brought to the Caribbean by the Spanish, but explorers the pig did very well in this landscape because of the climate and reproduction rate, and soon became wild and weren't domesticated anymore. The Native Americans did not like the pig because they destroyed their crops and stores and dug up the shellfish that they were so fond of harvesting. In fact, the Native Americans called the pigs filthy cutthroats and wanted to get rid of them as quickly as possible because they were basically taking over everything. These three historians looked at the animals starting from a very broad perspective and worked into a more narrow focus to a smaller area. Basically, they started talking about the entire Atlantic world, and as each one progressed, they became a more defined area and started to specify the types of animals that occurred both naturally and imported into the areas. What I'm trying to demonstrate is that the different uses that the Dutch and the Europeans had for the animals, from what I have seen from the above historians, did not go into detail how the animals were used by the Native Americans. With the Native Americans' uses, you can break them down into 4 categories. Sustenance, or food, domestic uses of animals, the symbolic uses of animals, and the economic uses of animals. The first section, food, was one of the most common uses for animals that the Native Americans captured. The season would determine whether they hunted or fished. Usually, hunting occurred in the fall so that they could prepare the village for the winter. One passerby came to a village and saw 40 or 50 hindquarters of deer hanging up to dry. My guess is when they hunted for the entire village and prepared for the entire village instead of just doing it per family, because the families might not get enough to cover themselves, but if the whole village hunted and gathered that fall to prepare for the winter for the whole village, everyone would be taken care of. It was a very communal spirit. They usually fished in the spring and the summer. When they hunted, they used bows and arrows and would manipulate the forest, making trails so they could move quietly and hunt more effectively. They didn't always catch and kill the animals by hunting. Sometimes they would make noise and herd them and then get them into snares and trap them. They caught and killed all varieties of animals. Most popular was deer, but they also got fawns and hares and foxes, just to name a few. They had multiple ways of preparing the food, such as making deer sausage, roasting the meat, drying, and then obviously cooking it in different ways over the fire. The kinds of fish that they caught included eel, perch, pike, catfish, bass, and shad. But their favorite catch was the sturgeon. The Dutch wouldn't touch the stuff, but the Native Americans just couldn't get enough. They loved the fish. The Native Americans also farmed to supplement what hunting and fishing didn't provide for. So they didn't always eat a lot of meat. They ate grains and native farming agriculture stuff too. The domestic uses for the animals is basically clothing. During the winter, they hung skins such as deer and bear and panther about their body, and depending on the age of the person in the summertime, they would wear a patch to cover certain spots or nothing at all. They also used deer skin to make stockings and shoes to cover their feet and legs when it was cold. They used bits of bone and feathers as ornamental decorations or accessories, among other things. Some of the symbolic uses, such as religious ceremonies or belief systems. It showed respecting certain animals. Certain Native American tribes revered the wolf. The reason is part of what we might be called their creation myth. The story doesn't start at how the Native Americans were created, but rather how they came to the land. The story or myth goes that Native Americans began as animals and lived under the earth, and one day one of the tribesmen found a hole in the surface of the earth, so he climbed out, and while exploring he came across a deer. Well, he killed it and took it back to his people under the earth and ate it because they usually lived on a diet of small animals such as rats. The tribe decided that what they would do now was to move from under the earth to live on the surface, thus making the tribe's men and women humans instead of animals. This first venture out of the darkness was one from the tribe of the wolf. Other tribes do not completely share this myth, but what they have is similar. Other animals that the natives believe were their ancestors also include the rattlesnake and the tortoise. If they revere the animal, they're more than likely not to kill it. An example also is of the white deer. They wouldn't kill the white deer, but the black deer that they came across, they probably wouldn't kill either because that was a bad omen. It's the regular brown deer that they would kill. The white ones they saw as a higher being, something to be respected, something divine. Point here, certain tribes referred to the rattlesnake as grandfather, and as long as they left him alone, he wouldn't attack them, and so they didn't kill rattlesnakes. A use for the animals, the fourth use, was for economic. The fur trade was obviously a big deal for the Dutch. There were certain tribes that figured out what the Dutch liked, and so they hunted and killed more animals so that they could trade with the Dutch for things like muskets for protection. Most of the time the Dutch traded the fur from the natives for wampum, which is basically the currency that the Native Americans had, the little pieces of small shellfish strung up. Not all the tribes hunted extra for trade, but regardless of this, the Native Americans lived closely with Mother Earth and respected that she was the one that provided for them. Without what she gave them, Mother Earth gave her, the Native Americans, they wouldn't be able to survive. The Dutch really didn't hunt a lot for their own food. They grew most of it, or they imported it from the Netherlands. That being said, they did hunt, but because their number one favorite food was pig, and that was available in the New World because it was brought to Virginia and Massachusetts earlier. The Dutch did not use skins for clothing. They traded with the Native Americans. They got their clothing from manufactured textiles, and they were imported from home. They saw fur as a trade good, and thus bringing it into the economic sector. The only reason they made a settlement in New Netherland was so that no one else would take away their market. And apparently the fur that they got from the New World was such a big commodity and worth so much money at home, they're like, we'll just send it over there. There's not a lot of symbolism of the animal shown in the Dutch culture, but there are a few. An example of one is if you called somebody a dogfoot, it was a very derogatory insult, very bad. Now we laugh at it. Another example is most often royalty would be associated with a particular animal. Lion, eagle, or some other strong animal that they could really get behind. And this was often seen on their family crest. The uses of the animals by the Native Americans were in fact very different from that of the Dutch. I have looked at the four categories: sustenance, domestic, symbolic, and economic uses for both the Native Americans and the Dutch. They are so drastically different from one another on 3 of the 4 sections that indicates that the Native Americans may have in fact treated the earth and its animals far better than the Dutch. The Dutch saw the Native Americans as savages and unchristian, uneducated beings, yet they took better care of the land than that of the refined Christian people from Netherlands.